Hello and welcome to Friendly Stories. Here I am today in Mojácar, Andalucía. Mojácar is on the Costa de Almería, and I'm actually celebrating my first wedding anniversary here with my husband and thought I'd read you a story. So I'm going to read Mr. Bump by Roger Hargreaves. Okay, so should we have a look? Here we go. Shh. Story time. Shh. It's story time. This is a sad story. The trouble was that Mr. Bump just could not help getting into little accidents. If there was something for Mr. Bump to bump into, he'd bump into it all right. For example, or for instance, if you were to see Mr. Bump walking out down the street and you were in town, if there happened to be something in the way of Mr. Bump, what do you think that would happen? What do you think would happen? Bump! Oh dear, poor Mr. Bump. Mr. Bump was just the same at home. He lived in an extremely nice house, but even there he couldn't help getting into little accidents. For instance, one morning Mr. Bump went outside. He noticed that a chimney had a loose tile. I must go fix that, he thought to himself. So that's what he did. He went to get himself a ladder. It was a very, very long ladder. Mr. Bump walked up the garden path with a ladder on his shoulder. Do-do-do-do-do, He turned the corner of the garden path. Crash! Went the living room window. Oh dear, thought Mr. Bump, and he turned to see what had happened. Crash! Oh, went the kitchen window behind him. Oh dear, thought Mr. Bump again, and he rested the ladder against the wall of the house so that he could climb up it to mend the roof, the pot that was loose on the chimney. Crash! Went the bedroom window. So, you can see how Mr. Bump had his little accidents. Mr. Bump had had many jobs, but somehow they never seemed to last very long. And as soon as anything got lost, broken, splintered, or chipped, or snapped, or cracked, or torn, or burst, or wrenched, or crunched, or split, or slit, Mr. Bump got the blame. For instance, when Mr. Bump worked on a farm, he tripped over the farm dog and spilt the milk, which he was carrying for the farmer's wife. And the cat lapped it all up. Oh dear. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a postman, he put his hand inside the pillar blocks to get the letters, and then the fire brigade had to come and set his hand free because it got stuck. Dear. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a bus conductor, he fell off the bus and he couldn't catch up with it again, and all the passengers travelled without having to pay anything for free. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a carpenter, he found that he was hammering his thumb more than a nail. Oh dear. So, in order to recover from his series of rather unfortunate happenings, Mr. Bump decided to take a holiday. There he could think, about what sort of job he'd like to do, and also that he wouldn't be a nuisance to anybody else. So off he went to the station to catch a train to the seaside. While Mr. Bump was on holiday, several things happened. For instance, he fell off a boat and the lifeboat had to come and rescue him. For instance, one day when he was quietly walking along the beach, minding his own business, he got his foot stuck in a bucket and he couldn't get it out, so he had to walk around with it on his foot for hours. For instance, another time, he was walking along the beach when he walked straight into a large hole. Help! Oh dear. And he had to stay there all night because he couldn't climb out of it. However, you'll be pleased to know that despite all these little accidents, Mr. Bump enjoyed his holiday immensely. And while he was there, he had a splendid idea about what sort of job he should do. It was quite the best idea that Mr. Bump had ever had. An absolutely splendid idea. And now Mr. Bump works happily for Mr. Barley, the farmer. Mr. Barley has a rather large apple orchard on his farm, and that's where Mr. Bump works. Mr. Bump's job is picking apples. But he doesn't use a ladder to climb up the tree to get them. No, 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 like normal apple pickers. He just walks about. And before long, well, Mr. Bump, being Mr. Bump, walks into a tree and bump, an apple falls out. The apple falls down and Mr. Bump catches it. This makes the job of picking apples much easier. And Mr. Bump is very pleased with his new job. And Mr. Barley is very pleased about his new apple picker. So you see, the story of Mr. Bump isn't such a sad story after all. And if you ever bump yourself, you know what to do, don't you? Go and eat an apple picked by Mr. Bump, and then you won't feel your bump anymore. You'll remember that next time you have a bump, won't you? Good. The end.